Uh, let's now welcome Andy Barnes. Take it away.
Thank you very much, David. So welcome everybody. This is a show and tell presentation. I want to give a brief overview of what I've been doing as a teacher and as a master's level and PhD level doing my research into rhetoric and corrective feedback. This is more a case of things that I found have worked for me, and I really welcome any tips or comments or questions you have. If you'd like to put them into the chat at any time, we can then talk about them at the end. So let's get started. The first thing then is just with an overview. So I'm going to talk about why written corrective feedback, looking a bit at the teacher perspective and written corrective feedback styles. Then I'm going to look a little bit at my master's research and one of the outcomes of that, do students view take-home feedback? And then looking at drafting and dynamic written corrective feedback in two pilot studies I'm kind of in the process of doing now. And finally, looking at the pros and cons of different ways to administer feedback. So I guess the reason a lot of you are here is we're of the belief that we are using written corrective feedback in the sense that it's effective. But that's still to say that there is the elephant in the room which we should address, which is that of Truscott's case against grammar correction in the L2. And for Truscott, who is a peer of Krashen, he felt that grammar correction is not supported by the theory specifically of order of acquisition. And he also put forward that the data at the time was not conclusive, mainly because there was a lot of studies not using control groups. He also pointed to harmful effects such as anxiety cost. And one I think is time better spent. And I think as teachers, we realize we spend a lot of time on written corrective feedback. But counter to that, we have Ferris and Bruton, who are in or effective corrective feedback. Ferris recognizes that more research needs to be done with control groups. And Bruton put forward the idea that a lot of these studies have been done in laboratory testing situations, whereas we maybe need to design testing and research that better reflects the realities of what we do in the classroom as teachers. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the theories. I'm not really going to go into this, to be honest, but there are two great books here that go into the theoretical perspectives, one from the SLA point from Sheen in 2011, and also one that brings together different theories to inform new theories of written corrective feedback by Birchner and Storch in 2016. And these by Birchner and Storch kind of informed my research at master's level and going forward, such as the cognitive processing of input and corrective feedback, and activity theory feedback as an activity. These are, of course, in the references if you want to look at them. So next, let's look at the teacher perspective. There's a wonderful research paper by Lee in 2009 that looked at 10 mismatches between what teachers believe they should be doing and what they are actually doing. This is quite an extensive study taking on points of view and data from many teachers across a broad spectrum. I've highlighted here in blue, these are the mismatches that kind of informed and helped shape my master's research. So mismatch 2 was that teachers realized perhaps they should use selective marking, but they find themselves correcting everything when they give feedback. And often that's to do with stakeholder expectations, be that of their other teachers, the students, parents, or administration. Mismatch 8, I think a lot of teachers realize when we're going through writing, process writing is often the goal, going through this drafting process. But a lot of teachers are doing one-shot writing in class because maybe they do not have time due to the syllabus constraints. So they find themselves doing a new writing assignment week on week and just saying, here's your feedback, please look at it at home. And then mismatch 10 is a case of how much time we spend giving the feedback and how much time students spend with it. Is it worth it? So the next mismatches I've highlighted are informing what I'm looking at in my PhD, which is more to do with learner engagement. And here in mismatch 3 and 7, is talking about the teachers realize they want students to start taking greater autonomy and responsibility for learning by themselves, finding the errors themselves, and correcting future assignments by themselves. But a lot of the feedback practices are more direct, and there's not really that room for the student to actually take charge of their own learning. and mismatch 4, which is a lot of us are using error codes, but we often say to each other that, yeah, we do realize some students have limited ability to understand these codes. So let me move on now to written corrective feedback styles. Rod Ellis, in a paper in 2009, gave a really nice brief overview of the different styles. So we've got direct corrective feedback, indirect corrective feedback, which is very common and easy to recognize. Then you've got the metalinguistic feedback, where you can see like the error code is being provided above an indirect underline and maybe some explanation of what that code means. He also talked about the focus of the feedback. Is it unfocused? Are we comprehensively correcting everything? Or is it focused? Are we just looking at 1 or 2 grammar points? Perhaps we're matching it to the target language we're looking at in our grammar classes. Also, this was in 2009. It was at the sort of early stages of e-feedback and call. And so there was some mention of technology to enhance feedback. And the last point of reformulation is where sometimes we find as teachers, it goes beyond giving corrective feedback. We are rewriting the sentence for the student. So there's some other notable styles and implementations. I'd like to mention oral feedback, interactional feedback, based on, so it's written feedback, but we're maybe doing an audio recording. And that's quite nice as a way of further exercises of listening activities, Q&A activities for the student, and also peer feedback. But today I'm more interested in looking at all implementations, specifically to writing and dynamic written corrective feedback. So I'd like to look at this call implementation here. This is Mark My Words by Milton, 2004. Now, unfortunately, this was looked to be a great add-on to Microsoft Word, but it doesn't seem that it's available anymore, but I can talk about it a little bit. Basically, you take the Word document, and this system would allow the teacher to highlight the error and then embed in the error exactly what the problem was, and as well embed resources into the error. So the students could then go to external resources, websites. And I thought that was a really nice approach of bringing the resources to the student when they might not know what they're looking for, especially in an EFL context. So next, I'd like to look at a little bit of my master's research and the question of, do students view take-home feedback? So as before, I mentioned that a lot of teachers are in this habit of giving weekly assignments, giving back feedback with the expectation students will look at home and apply it in their next assignment. So I'm going to look a little bit as well as how I administered this. I used a Moodle in 2019 or 2018-19 for this, which, as you probably all know, is a content management system. Teachers can set up course materials and give assignments, as I did. Students can participate in online activities and also complete assignments. What's lovely about this is you can control the environment, so they can actually do the writing exercise within the Moodle. And I believe we can also detect, if we wish to, whether or not students have actually copied and pasted from a Word document. There are some meta tags in there if you're looking for them. As well, within the system, we can provide e-feedback. So what I did in my study was I was providing indirect feedback using HTML coding behind the scenes. The students would see this, whereby if they hover their cursor over an indirect correction, they then get a metalinguistic cue. And it's also a hyperlink, obviously, as well. Down here, you can give some positive feedback as well. But this is a hyperlink to resources within the system. So a great thing about having the resources within the system is, again, we can see which students are actually looking at the resources and engaging with that feedback. So within Moodle, we can pull out a CSV file of all the student activities, and we can see by ID. So I've stripped out the student names for this presentation, but we can see the time, when they did it, the student ID, what page was be looking at. And here I kind of divided it over the different grammar pages I was looking at, and it really gave me the real information of what students were actually doing with their feedback rather than what they were reporting to me in their questionnaires. So that brings me to this. What did they do? Well, though the students reported very positively about the written corrective feedback, said, oh, they loved the style, they found it very useful, they go back to look at it again. the activity logs told quite a different story. So we can see here, in total, there was 17, 16 in the group, and this is week 1. Very high engagement in week 1, but straight away, week 2, it just drops off completely, and leading into week 3, to the point, actually, I put the point of intervention, which you can see down here, and students were directly encouraged to please look at the previous assignment's feedback before moving on to write the next assignment. And there was a bit of an uptick, but again, it drastically dropped off. So ultimately, there was a lack of engagement, which draws to the obvious question, how can we ensure students engage with the feedback? So one question which might answer this is whether to use drafting or not in our assignments. So writing it as a process involves the drafting and redrafting of the document. The majority of studies into written corrective feedback are using academic writing classes. There are some studies without drafting, such as my own and Sheen, but the majority of them are one-shot studies without drafting. Mine was a little more longitudinal without drafting, and unfortunately the results weren't positive. Sheen's one-shot study, though, I did get positive results. There's been 2 to my knowledge, maybe there might be more now, but to my knowledge, there's been 2 pieces of research looking specifically at the effectiveness of drafting with a control group that didn't draft, and that was Chandler 2003, Shintali, Ellis, and Suzuki. And from there, what they showed was drafting really does have that positive effect, I guess, because it's forcing the student to engage with that feedback. And that was one of my main conclusions from my own study. Drafting necessitates learner engagement with the feedback. So this leads me to a pilot study, which I've been kind of doing. I call it pilot study, something a case study I've been doing the last 2 years since I finished my master's, pardon me. The setup is basically a private lesson. It's a highly motivated student from Tokyo, female and retired. She started learning English because of professional needs. And there were potentially some issues there with fossilization. Now, if we look at the methodology, the approach we used, it was informed by this idea of more the social theories of actually engaging with the student, not just being a one-way activity of teacher down, but getting the ideas from the student, what they were expecting from the feedback, and adapting the approach as we went through the 2 years. So it starts with, she wrote a draft and then indirect feedback was given. She would redraft and then I would give direct feedback on the subsequent draft. So feedback style, as I say, was negotiated throughout. And errors were discussed in ad hoc manner on request by the student or by myself if I felt there was a specific difficult issue that needed addressing. So this is kind of how it started, and this is probably, I think this is week 2. And initially the student liked to actually handwrite the assignments. As some of you might recognize, Breaking New English is a very good resource. So she'd handwrite the assignments and then scan them and send them to me. So at which point I was using a digital stylus to replicate written feedback style. At this, as you can see, it's very limited the amount of correction I was doing. It was rather perhaps too focused. And after that, by her own choice, she produced a Word document. And again, this time I was giving direct feedback with the stylus, with some of the tools within Microsoft Word. After some discussion, me as a teacher, I was developing my skills, and also as a learner, she had a feeling that she wanted more unfocused style. She wanted me to correct everything. So that is something we moved toward. And so I was using Microsoft Word to highlight and use the comment facility to actually give that indirect feedback. And then we kept it in Microsoft Word and using track changes to give direct feedback, which we can see in red. And I feel that was a very easy way to actually, it's very clear to the student, this is direct feedback and the different feedback styles. Regarding administration, this was all done through email. Now, this was a one-on-one situation, so it was very easy to keep track of these emails and the threads. I have tried doing email administration with a class of even 6, and it soon becomes quite unmanageable. And I started wanting to move the students over to content management systems like Moodle and like Google Classroom. However, there's a study by Tafazoli, Ratzadeh and Hosseini in 2014, which looks specifically at a much larger scale administration through email and written corrective feedback. Again, that's in the references. So what were the outcomes? Now, because this is just a case study, we can take these outcomes with a grain of salt, but the student was happy because they achieved their personal goals in relation to achieving an ACEN Pre-1. And I also asked an external examiner to grade the week 2 writing and the week 90 writing. So I believe, she got an ACEN grade 5 across the board on things like task response, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource management, and grammatical range and accuracy. And there's this, as I was informed, the grade 7 is actually the requirement needed to get into some of the more red brick universities in the UK. However, I take this more to mean that at least no damage was done, so to speak. So she achieved her goal, she was very happy, so I was pleased for the student. But it needs to be noted, this was a long-term investment of time from the student and from me, and it required a good amount of study commitment, and that brings me back here. This was a highly motivated student, not always the case with our students, as we well know. So next, another way to answer the question, how do we get students to engage with written corrective feedback? And something I'm looking at the moment is this dynamic written corrective feedback. This is a methodology for written corrective feedback coming out of the Brigham Young University. So the main researchers are Hartshorne, Evans, and Krauss, which are leading this movement. And there have been some other researchers as well who are looking at this. So it's based on skill acquisition theory of De Keyser. And the main thing is the paragraphs, the student writes a paragraph, it's drafted and corrected using indirect feedback using metalinguistic codes. On top of that, the student then tracks the errors by the code type in a tally sheet. And finally, the student was also expected to keep a log of the errors in more detail in context of the sentence. So the fourth things which they push is it's meaningful in the sense that the student is able to identify high frequency errors for themselves, which can also lead to meaningful explicit instruction. It's timely and constant in the sense that feedback is actually being provided on a daily basis, and it's constant in the students have to produce a daily, or every lesson they're producing a new piece of writing or a new paragraph. It's manageable in the sense that the process is broken down into manageable tasks for the student. However, I'm not sure it's manageable in the sense for the teacher, because as we'll go through that next, but let me talk just briefly about the cycle. So the student writes for 10 minutes composition of paragraph. The teacher collects the paragraph, codes the errors, and scores the composition and returns it to the student. The student then records the errors in a tally sheet, types the errors into an error log, and resubmits a typed copy of edited composition. The teacher then gets it back and will further edit it with error codes. And then the student, again, will add those error codes into the log. And this process of 4 and 5, correction and recorrection, is happening until we get to stage 6, which is an error-free piece of writing. So there's no limit to how many drafts the student would go through in this process. Now, as I say, the students receive dynamic written corrective feedback on drafts on a daily basis. As I was reading this, I was very glad to see Pauline Friedman pointed out the issues of practicality. The study itself, I believe, had around 6 researchers, and each researcher was in charge of around 10 students. I myself, and I'm sure many of you, have quite large class numbers, and so providing this daily form of feedback is quite time consuming and somewhat arduous. However, the results were positive. Here, I think this is more to do with answering criticisms from Truscott. So here we can see rhetorical competence, writing fluency, and writing complexity were largely ineffective, but there's significant improvement for writing accuracy. So now I'd like to just briefly look at a second study by Cursor 2018. In this case, this was a much wider ranging study. They looked at beginner,
Remaining
intermediate.
time, 10 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much, beginner and advanced students. So exercises were timed and dynamic feedback was provided in unison with traditional grammar lessons. One thing they did differently was they grouped the error codes to global, local, and mechanical to give students a better sense of what they could perhaps be focusing on. And one of the greatest takeaways here was they found multilingual students improved self-editing skills. So they used a pre-test and a post-test design. And I feel that's kind of the goal of a lot of teachers, which was brought up in those 10 misconceptions, that we want the students to move toward the ability to self-edit. And of course here, largely significant results across all error types. So the pros and cons, I mean, the main pro, students can track their strengths and weaknesses, and the cons, time demand, teachers and students. So next I'd like to bring you to pilot 2. So I have given the students, following this, I've tried to digitize a lot of what I found in the research of Hartshorn et al. So this is the schedule, and students will be provided written corrective feedback using Word because it's an easily accessible software. The students count the error codes, and these are the error codes. So I've given each student a document in Google Classroom, but Google Sheets, sorry. So it's similar to Excel. And here they can find what the error code relates to and an error description. And in addition to that, we can then start pulling in information like links that go through to extra resources, which allow students to study by themselves on problematic areas. So as well, I kind of digitized their tally sheet. So this is, as I say, this is adapted from the work of Hartshorn and Cursor. And one thing I added to it was this conditional formatting, which so it's highlighting to the student maybe some problem areas as the tallies increase, but it also, I'm trying to give them maybe some positive feedback as well to say, you know, you're doing well with the green areas. And the students can then know themselves what areas are they struggling with, what should they focus on. I also want to make the process as simple possible as the error log. So we can see here, these word choices are drop down, the local error, global error, other error auto populates based on the error type choice. The assignment name auto populates the drop down based on what students write in the tally sheet, and students are encouraged to basically copy and paste the error and use underline to highlight it. So making the process as simple as manageable possible is a key thing. And as well for the teacher, we can now, because this is a live online system, we can pull in the data into a master sheet. So we can see what the class maybe needs. We can start adjusting our plans for our lessons and what we want to focus on. Maybe it's verb tense, maybe it's determiners or word choice. We can also see some students that might need further training. Maybe they're struggling to actually implement this form of tally sheet and using the written corrective feedback. And also when it comes to one-on-one counseling, maybe something like word form here and paragraphing was not something that we addressed in class, but it's something this particular student needs some assistance with, so we can give some tailored advice to the student. So finally, using Google Classroom, I found this very easy to pull in the tally sheet, and all the students can then see for them, can get individually assigned, and you can manage this quite easily, and the students can as well. So the pros and cons, well, pros, conditional formatting highlights points for improvement. Versatility of linking to external resources and setup time is significant. That brings me to the last 2 minutes of my presentation, and that's administration of feedback. So there's many ways to administrate feedback. I've noted Moodle and Google Classroom. I know there's Blackboard. If you guys have some advice on using Blackboard, I'd love to hear it. So pros and cons of pen and paper. Well, the feedback is fast and flexible. We can easily, quickly give written corrective feedback. Also, from a research perspective, I find using C unit and T unit analysis is quick and easy by hand. The cons, illegible scripts, and also creation of tally sheets, very time consuming. Also, I believe in McLean's presentation yesterday, he spoke about authenticity as a concern for Japanese students, particularly, are these skills transferable to them into the working world? So that brings us to Microsoft Office, and here authenticity definitely for the students, we're giving them the tools which they can use in the working world, which is important, it seems, to Japanese learners. Also, Microsoft Word and other word processors have these very useful tools like track changes, commenting, linking to external resources, word count. Now we can share editing permissions with OneDrive, but it's not so easy. One of the main cons though is plagiarism. It's easier to do, but it is easier to spot. Google Docs, so the Google Suite. So yeah, the main one, shared editing positions are so easy with Google Drive and pulling in live data. However, on analysis, it's a limited tool set, but then again, it is a free service. Authenticity, I know some workplaces do actually use Google Docs. However, Microsoft is still obviously the main stakeholder. So finally, administration, we've got email. Limited training is required. Transferable skills to the workplace. If students don't know how to email, we can teach them that skill. However, as I mentioned, it's difficult to manage as student numbers increase. Google Classroom, very quick setup time, ease of use with Google Docs and Google Drive. However, I've been looking, there seems to be very limited at analytics to be able to track really at a granular level what students are doing. When we compare that to Moodle, we have full flexibility of control of the environment, and we can really track students' activity within the Moodle at a granular level, which is great for research. Cons though, the setup time can be significant, and authenticity of using the Moodle, skills don't really transfer into the real world so much. So I guess in conclusion, ultimately, my focus, my ethos is to hopefully make the best of the tools at hand and kind of present ideas for regular teachers that can make the best use of the tools we have. So these are my references, and thank you for your time and any questions. Thank you.
I would like to do two. I'd like to do the questions according to the ones first put in chat. And Eduardo Lage Otero had the first question.
Yeah, that's a great question, Eduardo. Thank you. So the research is kind of like leaning us toward that with lower levels proficiency students, direct feedback is more easier for them to manage, and it's also more appreciated by the students. There's been a very recent book on student engagement, I believe published last year, which kind of gave that message as well, that students do prefer more direct feedback. However, higher level learners seem to prefer the indirect because they like working with the feedback, and they don't really want to just be told the answer, they want to figure it out for themselves. So more indirect forms for the higher level learners, more direct forms for the beginner learners.
Then James Underwood had, thank you, James Underwood had another question.
Certainly. Where do you keep a tally? So I originally set it up as an Excel sheet, but I found it just worked better because the students are comfortable using Google to do a Google form. And as well, it's just easier to pull out all the data out into a master sheet. You can do it, I believe, with OneDrive, but it was just a lot easier for me to use Google, and that's why I made that decision. One of the things I would say is conditional formatting in Google Sheets is not as straightforward as in Excel. You have to actually have some rudimentary coding skills to get it to work as you wish.
And the last question is Kevin Ryan.
Yeah, there was an online software called Scribble a couple of weeks ago. I saw at a conference. And writing, do you know of any other technological advances in that area?
I know, but thank you, Kevin. And actually, this is kind of what I was hoping to get, because this is not just for me to, I don't have all the answers, unfortunately, but I really appreciate that. So that's something that I'd be interested in looking at. And as well, we had a talk earlier today by Ulatani-san, and they had a smart template thing, I think it was, and that had some really nice ideas on how to balance feedback types with the student. Because one of the things I find myself when providing feedback is I do lean toward what's been taught to me through my experience as a student, correct everything. And obviously doing that, there's going to be an undue balance put on negative feedback as opposed to positive feedback. So I'd be really interested to look at this Scribo and see how it would work. As for other feedback types, I've had discussions with some of the people who did research at university level, and they had some really good positive results with giving oral feedback embedded as audio files into Word documents. The students would then listen to the document and they have to figure out, so it's kind of a comprehension exercise of listening. They can then have discussions with the teacher, maybe discuss it as a task within peer-to-peer groups as well. So I think there's some really nice research out there on alternative methods of looking at feedback.
And we are, unfortunately, we're out of time. If anybody would like to continue this discussion or ask questions, if we could, you can go to the lounge, and Andrew, if Andrew will be there, he will request a breakout room that you can then request. And what I'd like to do, if everybody could please unmute your microphones, and let's give a round of applause to Andy Barnes.